Hello students, we will continue our series of styles and movements, and today we will be looking at part 3. In part 3 we will be talking of late modernism, a term coined by Charles Jenks, and we will look at the first part of late modernism today. The building that you see here is a part of late modernism, but more importantly it is a part of high-tech architecture. So, we will move from late modernism later on into a deeper study of high-tech architecture. Late modernism started around the 1960s and has carried forward architectural concept of the modernists. These concepts form the foundation on which late modernism has been built. If we compare the two dominant movements in the later half of the 20th century, according to Charles Jenks, they are postmodernism and late modernism, and they have many subsets under them. Broadly, if we try to differentiate the two, in postmodernism the architects claim their buildings are rooted in place in history, unlike the abstract buildings of their predecessors the modernists and their contemporary competitors the late modernists. Therefore, they look back to history and try to bring historical impact or impulse into their buildings. Also their buildings have ornamentation and symbolism, something that was a complete no-no for the modernist architects. In late modernism, they disdain all historic imagery like the modernists and like the immediate predecessors or forebears the modernists, and a little further back even the architects of the international style. They have concentration, their work is concentrated on space, geometry and light, and a general refusal to discuss about stylistic matters. They do not want to classify their buildings in X style or Y style. They want to talk about buildings in terms of function, in terms of space, geometry and light, in terms of technology. Postmodernists rely on modern construction techniques and historical memory, like in the buildings which we will be looking at, the Neustraat's Gallery in Stuttgart by James Stirling or the Humana building in USA by Michael Graves. Late modernists on the other hand believe in abstract propositions of geometry and organization like the Athenaeum in Indiana by Richard Meier, and or they approach the building as a series of technical problems that need to be solved by teamwork, like we see in the HSBC building in Hong Kong by Norman Foster. This is the Neustraat's Gallery and this is the Athenaeum by Richard Meier. This is a visual comparison of the buildings that fall into these two categories. The Humana building, postmodernist, the HSBC building, late modernist, more typically high-tech architecture. So in late modernism there was an apparent boredom with the plain forms of the international style, which caused these architects to graduate to sculptural expressionism or geometric expressionism, expressing the building as a sculpture or expressing the building as a composition of geometric masses. So we have in sculptural expressionism the Ronshaw Chapel, and then we have the Yale University by Louis Kahn. Now when we look at the Ronshaw Chapel, it is not exactly in the late modernist period, because that begins somewhat later, because this was built in 1955. We would rather have late modernism, if we study it would be somewhere in the 1960s. So we can say that because of the dramatic shift in Corbusier's architecture with buildings like the Ronshaw Chapel, this is the early stage of late modernism with a sculptural expression in the building. It is asymmetrical sculptural form. It is a massive abstract sculpture, the entire building. We have studied it in our series on Corbusier. More chronologically in the right sequence would be the late modern TWA Terminal by Eero Saarinen in the John F. Kennedy Airport, which was built in 1961. It is under late modernism. Sculptural expressionism is the subset, in which sculptural forms with references to wings, sails and birds is normally used. There are Art Nouveau similarities also, because Art Nouveau they used biomorphic, zoomorphic, osteomorphic forms, particularly for example in the works of Antoni Gaudi. But these buildings in the late modern time have a sculptural quality They are sculptures by themselves in the 20th century, and this has been achieved because of the evolution that has taken place in modern building technology. So, that way technologically these buildings are far superior. Now, the TWA Terminal by Eero Saarinen is the first airport terminal in the world built on the concept of a single envelope design. That means the entire function of the airport is enclosed in one large box or envelope. The terminal wings have been lifted up. The entire building has been shaped in the form of the golden eagle, the national bird of the United States. The terminal wings are lifted up to reveal fully these glazed ends, and that allows passengers a view of arriving and departing aircraft, something that is always a fascinating sight for anybody who is traveling or passing through an airport. So, these are the views that we see here. And then of course, the overall building is a sculpture in poured concrete. So, there are sweeping wings, gentle curves, this confidence in the properties of reinforced cement concrete. The interiors also exploit RCC, the same flowing you find the same flowing spaces in the interiors, dramatically undulating surfaces you find on the inside also. Comparing it with the contemporary terminal, this is the Hong Kong airport designed by Norman Foster, which continued the idea, the concept of a single envelope design, but it is on a much more massive scale as technology has progressed from somewhere around 1961 to now 1998 of the Hong Kong airport. Much more greater space using this technology was doable at this time. So, a much more massive single envelope airport is the Hong Kong airport. Then again, under sculptural expressionism, we have the Sydney Opera House, a very obvious example of sculptural expression in which the outer shells are precast concrete sections which are clad in ceramic tiles that reflect the sky and water, and the opera house units are inspired by sails, and it is an iconic form that has become world famous. Then we find sculptural expressionism in the Pilgrimage Church in Germany by Bohm in 1972. You can see how sculpturally this form has been put together. Or we find this in the work of Santiago Calatrava, which this Lyon Setelas Airport railway station, which he designed around 1994. It refers to an enormous bird with spread out wings. So, somehow it draws us to a comparison with the TWA terminal, and it symbolizes flight with dynamism. Now, the comparison, the TWA terminal was an airport, and this happens to be a railway station, and apparently it is on a very massive scale that Calatrava has made this building. And we also find this evolution happening in late modernism, from the TWA terminal to the Lyon Setelas station, from RCC used in TWA to glass and steel along with RCC used in the Lyon station. Then we have this science center in Nemo designed by Renzo Piano in 1997. Surrounded by the sea, the building takes the shape of a ship's bow projecting out towards the water body. Or we have the Tenerife Concert Hall in Spain by Calatrava in 2003. Now, by 2003, late modernism, the movement late modernism had kind of wrapped up in the 1990s, but its DNA continues. Late modernism in its concept still continues in contemporary architecture, and we find that in the Tenerife Concert Hall in terms of sculptural expression. So, late modernism is a historical movement, was from somewhere in the late 1960s to the 1990s. It was monumental, high rise, glass and steel with technological clarity, and architects who worked were Richard Meier, Skidmore, Owings and Merrill, the firm, and I.M, etc. Then late modernism as a design language that continues even in our contemporary times, where the architectural language has been extended into contemporary work, especially high-tech buildings and buildings under Sculptural Expressionism with works of Calatrava, Richard Meier, Renzo Piano, Norman Foster, etc. And it's a broader interpretation of how modernist principles evolve. They do not get replaced entirely, they evolve and their DNA continues to work as that of late modernism in our contemporary times. This sculptural aesthetic that you find in the Tenerife Concert Hall, all concrete building which is characterized by a dramatic sweep of the roof like a crashing wave, soars to the height of 58 meters over the main auditorium, 58 meters over the main auditorium, and this very giant arc over 50 meters, this is supported by only 2 points with its tip suspended, it's defying gravity. High performance concrete has been used to make this arc with post tension steel cables to increase its durability under dynamic loading. The outer of the arc or even the building is covered with white ceramic mosaic tiles similar to the principles of goddess Tricandis that I had taught you while we were studying the works of Antoni Gaudi, how he used to use broken pieces of ceramics in his buildings, and here the ceramic tiles have been used similar to the concept of Tricandis, shimmering clean finish. The other important reason is that it protects the RCC of this building from the salt laden sea air around it and from erosion. Now the main hall or the symphony has more than 1600 seats and stage, and there is surround sound which is architecture and acoustic design makes possible, and it is through the way the interior geometry has been shaped, how the balcony and the seating design has been done, and how reflective materials have been used in the building. The main hall or the symphony also has organ pipes that emerge from both sides of the pit. Then there is the chamber hall which is about 400 plus seats. It reproduces the symphony hall amphitheater on a smaller scale. There are lobby which is accessible from two sides, which has the press room, the shop, the cafeteria, the dressing rooms, etc. And the exterior has got two terraces overlooking the sea. These are the terraces overlooking the sea on both sides of outside the auditorium, and the entire building has got a very strong central axial symmetry. Within the building there are these sweeping planes with trincadis embedded on them. You can see trincadis here. If you watch it carefully, you can see the broken ceramic tiles have been used here. And these are some other buildings of Calatrava based on sculptural expressionism. Now coming to geometric expressionism under late modernism, we have to go all the way back into the 18th century when Ledoux and Bouley developed or made buildings showing them as a geometrical mass, whether it was a cenotaph to Newton or this pyramid that one of them had designed under what was called as visionary neoclassicism. Leading style of public buildings in the 1970s was geometric expressionism, and Louis Kahn was a major contributor. So he brought in geometric expressionism in the Sher-e-Bangla National Assembly in Dhaka in 1962 to 1983, the time it was built, and we also find geometric expression in I.M. Ahmedabad from 1962 to 1974 that he designed. Now when we talk of geometric expressionism, we find in I.M. Ahmedabad the emblematic use of squares, circles and semicircles, and Kahn's particular disposition towards Islamic prototypes. Now Kahn's architectural style was notable for its simple forms and compositions. We find that in the Yale University Art Gallery, we find that in the Kimbell Art Museum in Texas 1972. His style was powerful and massive, and particularly it had geometric forms like we find in the National Assembly or the Sher-e-Bangla Assembly of Bangladesh. There is also this tremendous beauty of brutalist work in the Sher-e-Bangla Assembly, and throughout the building you find geometric forms, semicircles, circles, etc. throughout the building. Kahn's architectural style, he used exposed bricks and concrete and developed these monumental facades both in I.M. Ahmedabad in 1960 and exposed concrete in the Salk Institute in California in 1965. There are some other views of the beautiful Salk Institute, the central axis here in the building, and how wonderfully the views have been framed by him. There was a poetry of light and exposed materials. We find that in the Exeter Library, and continuously in building after building we find that he goes in for geometric expression. The same architectural techniques that he used we find in the Bangladesh assembly and in I.M. Ahmedabad, where there was the use of local materials and there were these large geometrical facades in both these buildings. Then again, if we compare them, these facades having these large geometrical openings in the Sher-e-Bangla assembly in I.M. Ahmedabad, and because of these geometrical cutouts, the light and shade, how they impact the building. Then we have the Art Museum of South Texas by Philip Johnson and Burgee architects in 1972, again an example of geometric expression. The National Gallery of Art, the East Building by I.M. 1978, again an example of geometric expression. And one of the most famous is the pyramid in the Louvre in Paris by I.M. in 1989, pure geometric expressionism in which there is a perfect glass pyramid, modern in form, ancient in meaning, in the historic French palace where it has been installed. This beautiful pure geometric glass pyramid. Then we come to the late modernist subset of articulation. The concept of articulation means clear skin and bone structure with repeated joints that you can easily see on the building. The building speaks the structural language very clearly. You can easily identify it, like in the Kimbell Museum, the entire structural system, how the load transfer is taking place from the vault to the columns is very clearly visible to us. That means the structure has been well articulated, jointed, segmented, able to express clearly and to unite by joints. This is another term from vocabulary, English vocabulary, that we are using in architecture. We really seen the word called inflection when we were looking at the works of Louis Sullivan, where the building which is having difference from the side to the center, top and bottom, that building is not monotonous, and that means the building has got inflection. It's a vocabulary or with regard to speech. Now, in the Kimbell Art Museum, it's a masterpiece of rational geometric expressionism. It's got pure vaults that define space, that guide light, and they evoke a stillness in the environment. B.V. Doshi was also influenced by the vaults of Kahn, the spatial clarity, the material expression, and the relationship between structure and light. He was strongly impacted by it and he used it in his projects. He began using it in an earlier project for Atira called Atira Housing, but that was not an inspiration drawn from Kahn, it was more an inspiration of the Catalan vaults used by Corbusier. But in Sangat definitely there was an influence of Kahn. It was not a copy that he made in Sangat, but rather he reinterpreted the vault through the Indian lens. They were climate sensitive and they were cost conscious. So here we have the visual comparison in the Kimbell Art Museum, how the vaults have been used by Louis Kahn, and then in Sangat B.V. Doshi uses the vault, and he uses the vault in the Gandhi Labour Institute in 1985. Another building where we find articulation is the Center Beheer office building in the Netherlands by Herman Hertzberger in 1972. There are these 56 square modules that you see, which are visually and structurally articulated. Very clearly you can read the structural and the visual language. The structure is expressed, it is not hidden. Every element from the floor grids to the stairwells is clearly expressed, or I can say clearly articulated in the building. Coming next to another subset of late modernism, we have seen Sculptural Expressionism, seen Geometric Expressionism, we have seen Articulation. Let us look at the white aesthetic. Now that is something you are familiar with because you have seen the Villa Savoy, the Gropius House, the Farnsworth House and other buildings of the international style architects in white planar geometry. From internationalism we are introduced to the white aesthetic. The white planar geometry then gets exaggerated in late modernism with the works of Richard Meier. So when we compare Villa Savoy and the simple orthogonal geometry of the Villa Savoy with the tremendously complex asymmetry of the Athenaeum by Richard Meier in Indiana, the alignments of white planes is asymmetrical vis-a-vis the symmetrical arrangement of the international style architects. The interiors reveal a continuity with the international style architects and they are in white aesthetic, they are focusing on space, geometry and light. These are the early examples of white aesthetic, whether it is Villa Muller by Adolphe Loos, Villa Savoy, Le Corbusier, Schrader House, G.T. Rietveld, Tugendhat House, Mies van der Rohe, Gropius House by Walter Gropius, Farnsworth House again by Mies van der Rohe. These are all early examples where the international style architects worked on a very similar palette, the white aesthetic, all of them worked on that palette. So we have now the Athenaeum and you see the difference between the Villa Savoy and Athenaeum between symmetry and asymmetry. Again some of the pictures of the Athenaeum and how radically dynamic the form has become. Villa Savoy seems much more static compared to the Athenaeum, but like I said, when we go inside, the spaces seem familiar to us. There is light and transparency, but in late modernism what happens is there is greater light and transparency as compared to the modernist or the international style. Even for example, when we compare the ramp in the two, we see the penetration of light and then we see the penetration of so much more light in the Athenaeum. Now if we compare three buildings, we compare the Athenaeum with the Villa Savoy and the Tugendhat House, we find that there is transparency and light in all three of them, but in the Athenaeum we go with a curvy linear glass rather than the linear arrangement we find in Tugendhat and the Villa Savoy. Now coming to the white aesthetic of the Schrader House, we will look at it a little more deeply in terms of decomposition, recomposition. Now the Schrader House deconstructs the classical box into planes, lines and colors and then recomposes them again into a dynamic spatial composition. So when you look at it, it is not your usual box like the Villa Savoy or other international style projects, but it seems to have been, the box has been broken and put together again. It is an early example to treat architecture like an abstract painting. I had mentioned that when I was talking about the D style movement to which this house, under which movement this house is associated. Now looking at it in more simple terms, the basic form of the cuboid is there in the Schrader House, but it is decomposed by horizontal projections, vertical wall slabs, parapet panels and supports. A cube modified, but the cube in its essence. Now the idea of breaking the box, decomposing the box actually comes from Frank Lloyd Wright, who broke the box or destroyed the box. Wright created the basis for a new plasticity in architecture. And we observe that when we move from the square plan of Winslow House to the cross plan Ward Villett's, linear plan Roby and then the open plan of Falling Water. Here is a sketch showing that the box of Winslow, the cross plan of Ward Villett's, the linear plan of the Roby House and the organic or open plan of the Falling Water. Now if we look at the plan of the ground in the first floor of the Schrader House, we find that in the upper floor the entire house can be divided into single rooms by partitions, and when we remove the partitions it becomes one single flowing space. This is spatial experiment in the horizontal direction. There is flexibility of space that we find in the upper floor of the Schrader House. These are some of the views of the upper floor and also the use of primary colors that we find here. Remember again that in the manifesto that Antonio Santalli had written, he had talked that modern buildings will be using primary colors as the form of ornamentation. Now the white aesthetic becomes complex, and one of the iconic houses to define that is the Smith House by Richard Meier from 1965 to 67. It was Meier's first publicized house. It was a wooden construction with steel supports, and it had brickwork that he was used in the chimney that you see here. It was facing the sea, and you can see how complex it looks visually as compared to the earlier whites of the international style architects, in which the axis is oriented along this path. There is a path coming from behind the house, and the axis is oriented like that to moving towards the coastline. The path is from behind the house and then moving towards the coastline. The public space of the house where the family meets and entertains is actually to the rear of the house. By rear of the house I mean towards the sea. This is the actual house from behind, and amazingly, interestingly, at the front, the facade of the house is more or less a blank wall with just a few windows. This actually seems to be the rear of the house, but the truth is that this is the front of the house. This is where we enter the house. Now, so the public spaces where the family meets and entertains is on the rear. This is the rear facing the sea, overlooking the water. The whole house consists of 3 levels enclosed within a 3-sided glass enclosure. If you want a view, this is how the glass enclosure is. On 3 sides there is glass. Now the private space, which is on the rear of the house, or rather we should say the front of the house, when you enter the house from this side, that is where the private side is at the entrance facing the land, the woods and the road, and it has a series of closed cellular spaces. The private areas are organized in all the 3 levels. Here are the private areas behind an opaque facade. This is the opaque facade with just a few windows pierced into it. Now you see the evolution of the overall form from the Villa Stein to the Smith House, and how dynamic, radical decomposition has taken place in the Smith House versus the very coherent architectural form of the Villa Stein by Corbusier in 1927. Again, the idea of decompose and recompose, if we compare that with the Schrader House, interestingly, Richard Meier's concept of decomposition and recomposition seems less radical, not more, but less radical than the Schrader House, but it seems more refined, more ordered as compared to the Schrader House. It fits within the late modernist white aesthetic, the formal decomposition of space and geometry, which was a part of late modernism. Now when we look at the interiors, they are more radical and dynamic than the early white aesthetic. What I have done is I have taken these 3 shots of the interior of the Smith House and compared them with the Villa Savoy and the Tugendhat House, houses which you are by now quite familiar with, and I use them again and again to try to draw comparisons. Smith House has got a layered, visually active interior. There is a dynamic flow of space from in the horizontal direction and in the vertical direction. As you stand here, you look down towards the living room, massive use of glass, and Richard Meier transforms the white aesthetic from a formal shell which was Villa Savoy, which was the Tugendhat House, into a spatially radical, dynamic experience. Then again Richard Meier went ahead. Smith House happened in 65 to 67, and then later on, a little ahead in 69-71, he designed the Windstein House, which was not a minimalist white box. It was a very dynamic composition of interlocking forms, grids, terraces and voids, and Meier continued to break geometry, continued to create layered volumes, shift and slide them around each other. Turns out to be a massive house of 11 bedrooms, and it is much more radical in plan and in interior than the Smith House. The spatial program is very complex, 11 bedrooms and plus bathrooms, accessibility and simultaneous separation of personal retreats, family areas is a central theme behind the designing of this house, and the earlier concepts have also been reapplied. For example, the concept of the ramp that he brought in the Athenaeum, he continues that concept and uses it again here in the Winstein house. Then we have the Hop Villa in New York by Guanthame Siegel and Associates, stark white exterior, white aesthetic, geometric composition like the international style. The design employs cubes, cylinders and interlocking planes, but of course the house has become much more flamboyant, it is much more dynamic, the more ordered and more the simpler forms of the early white aesthetic, they are gone now. These are much more complex houses. It does have a smooth white surface which aligns with the minimal tendencies of the white aesthetic. It does draw heavily from the early modernist ideas of architects like Corbusier, but it is much more expressive in the way it experiments with space. So there were 5 architects: Guanthame Siegel, Peter Eisenman, Michael Graves in his early stage, Richard Meier and John Hedgeduck, who were classified as the whites in the 1972 Museum of Modern Arts exhibition. They had a shared commitment to modernist purity as seen in the white volumetric forms that these 5 architects created. So we have one of the most dynamic of these white aesthetic houses, the House 3, Miller House, Connecticut by Peter Eisenman. It was a decomposition of form. It had the same monochromatic white palette and a very clear geometric form, and it was aligned to the aesthetics of early modernism of Le Corbusier and the D-style movement, but Eisenman himself being a very key figure of the whites, he reinterpreted modernism through this very abstract geometric form, having pure geometry and this white palette. And this house is not bowing towards functionalism entirely. In fact, the walls of this house do not necessarily enclose space in a conventional manner. The stairs lead nowhere. The geometry often overrides utility. So this house is not totally based on the idea of form follows function. Function or rational arrangement of function is not the dominating principle behind this house. It is more a play of geometry that Eisenman has done. This is the process of decomposition of this house, how it begins with a simple cube and then gradually step by step it gets finally decomposed to this form. So this house in fact is a true example of radical decomposition. If you were to compare it with the Schrader house, which also had decomposition, but it was not so radical as this house. So with that we conclude the subset on the white aesthetic. Now we will be covering more of these houses under the white aesthetic in our series called Places to Live, where we will be discussing chronologically how houses have evolved in the 20th, 21st centuries, and several more houses might appear in that series as and they will be a part of the white aesthetic. We will come to that later. Thank you.